Hello, I'm Cindy Arenberg Seltzer, President and CEO of the Children's Services Council of Broward County. Welcome to another edition of Future First, Focus on Broward's Children. On a recent episode of our program, we focused on effectively identifying issues related to behavioral health and accessing help when needed. We discussed how, as a society, we recognize and treat the ailments of our bodies with little thought and without stigma, except when it comes to one of the most important parts of our physiology, the brain. Challenging as that is, historically there are groups where behavioral health is an even more delicate subject. In the previous program, we referenced, for example, how first responders often find it difficult to seek help to address behavioral health issues brought on by their line of work. Some of our panelists also discussed how communities of color often deal with behavioral health issues by shying away from the subject altogether. Studies show that African Americans and Latinos in particular hold stigmatizing beliefs about mental illness. Consequently, shame often results in individuals not seeking help for challenges such as depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, relationship and parenting problems, to name a few. The issue is made even worse by systemic racial inequities that often result in limited access to care, lack of or inadequate health insurance, provider bias, and lack of cultural competence. Joining me to discuss how behavioral health issues are addressed in communities of color are Kimm Campbell, Director of Broward County Human Services Department, Tiffany Lawrence, Project Director for One Community Partnership 2 at the Broward Behavioral Health Coalition, Easton Harrison with Youth Move Broward, and the Children's Services Council's own Laura Ganci, Director of Research and Planning. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming to discuss this important subject. Kimm, I want to start with you. The Human Services Department of Broward County and the Children's Services Council have been partners over the last couple of years in some very important racial equity work. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that work and then how you see that playing out in the field of mental health.
Sure. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me on. And the partnership between the Human Services Department and the Children's Services Council is really an exciting one. It's an example of quasi-governmental and a governmental entity coming together to really recognize that there are racial disparities that are at play that are preventing people that we want to serve from getting the help that they need. So the Undoing Racism work is really a set of trainings that allow us to use common language and have a common analysis about what racism is and how it plays out systemically and institutionally in our very own community. So we've trained probably just under 1,000 folks in Broward County so far across every system that's represented, including folks from the community and I believe starting today from Broward County schools, some actual high school students are going through the training. So it's exciting to be in a position to be able to address head-on the systemic and institutional racism that's really preventing people from being able to access services through establishing this common language, through looking at our policies and procedures, through partnering with the community and establishing a grassroots movement that really respects the humanity and integrity of the folks that live in the community who really need our services and support.
One of the things that I've really liked about the two-day workshops is that look at the institutions from the human side of the coin. Easton, that's some of what you do with your peer-to-peer support, and you've also been through the Undoing Racism. How have you seen that play out for you?
Yeah, definitely. So the Undoing Racism component, one thing that they touched on the most was basically how, from a systemic point of view, how racism does play out. A lot of times we kind of just feel like things aren't right, and the Undoing Racism component actually went into the nitty-gritty details as to how things are actually working. So finance was one of the main key components that they try to drive home. There's this concept called redlining, where you have communities that are not being invested in at the same proportion as other communities. And because of that, the services just aren't the same. These communities go through disparities such as health disparities, more diabetes, more mental health conditions. And on a peer-to-peer level, we see this all of the time. These are mainly the peers that we get from these areas, from these zip codes. And they always say the main thing is that there's a lot of stigma around mental health. Nobody talks about it in their communities, and they just don't have the finance to take advantage of the services.
That stigma idea was one of the things that was a driving force behind One Community Partnership #1. And how are you addressing that in One Community Partnership 2, Tiffany? How are we reaching into the community and trying to address that stigma?
So I think when talking about minority communities, you have to look at the culture when you're reaching out. So I'll take the African American or Black community. We're really ground rooted in the church. And there's a lot of stigma that comes out of the church, but there's a lot of stigma about mental health in general. And so it's really looking at the culture and seeing, well, if the church says that, mental health is spiritual, then we need to be able to speak to people about how it's spiritual and how beyond that, beyond going to church or beyond, going to the YMCA or wherever you go, is that there's a mental part that, you have to, reach out to that community in that way. So for example, church, mental health is a spiritual thing. A lot of people think, oh, you might have demons. So they relate it to demons and demonic, but you want to talk about using the pastor and using people within the church to kind of say, well, even though you think there's a spiritual part of it, God allowed mental health therapists to come in and be able to treat you. So, there's a mental health portion of it just like it's physical. So it's really about learning about that community and learning what the stigmas are and then reaching out to them based on that.
I saw a post on social media from a pastor who, during a sermon, African-American pastor, during a sermon, who was talking to the congregation about the importance of mental health and the importance of recognizing mental illness for what it is, which is an illness, and sort of moving the paradigm or the conversation from demonic possession to a health-related issue, right? And so he was saying to his congregation, just like you would go to the dentist when you have a toothache, you pray to Jesus and you go to the dentist, right? You have diabetes, you pray to Jesus and you go to the doctor. So some of y'all need to pray to Jesus and call your therapist. So it was a really, it was a nice, light way to introduce the concept to the congregation that it is okay to seek help for an illness, that there's no shame related to that. And it isn't one or the other. You don't have to choose your spiritual beliefs or your faith over seeking professional assistance for an illness so that you can get back to your highest functioning, healthiest self. So it was really great to see.
Wow. Was he local?
No.
Darn.
No.
We got to see if we can hook in some of our local pastors into that.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And true, I think, across cultures. It was one of the things that we talked about in the last episode was how we will seek that dentist, we'll seek help for so many things, but for some reason we're ashamed when it comes to our brains, but it's part of the body.
So, I think that part of that shame, society in general has that, right? Like, the stigma related to mental illness is pervasive in the United States in particular. And the way we used to treat patients was to institutionalize them away. They were the secret that you kept away from the family and you didn't want the neighbors and community to know. And so that's the way for decades it's been looked at. And what's interesting about communities of color, I think, is that what's happening in the broader society is magnified sometimes in communities of color. And then you have the overlay of racism and the very danger of weakness exposed in the dominant culture. And what I mean by that is that in the times of slavery, if you had somebody who was acting funny or not falling in line, you risk death or you risk being sold away. And so there's pressure on the community to act right. Don't say anything out of turn. Don't laugh out of turn. Don't do anything out of turn because your very life depends on it. And it's sort of coded in our DNA relative to survival in the communities of color, I think.
And then you see a lot of times where, somebody, let's say they have depression and they're being told, you got to toughen up because your ancestors went through this. Mm-hmm. And so because our ancestors have gone through slavery and they've experienced a lot of things, Jim Crow we're being told, toughen up. And a lot of times that's hurtful for mental health because you can't just toughen up. It's not, you can't hold the weight of what happened in the past on you, and that affects mental health.
Yeah, you're also minimizing really real feelings,
Yes.
right? I mean, I think in the Latino community as well, we have that narrative of it could be a lot worse. Be grateful for what God has given you, you know, and the immigrant experience can be particularly stressful, and especially right now with the political and social rhetoric around Latin American immigrants, you know, I think that it may be difficult for some people to think, okay, I need to seek help for something, you know, who can I trust, you know? I mean, how is that gonna help me to function in the society? Am I gonna be able to acclimate, you know, am I gonna be judged? It's just, you know, completely compounded by all of the other stress they're already feeling.
You found something interesting in your research about a willingness to identify as anxious rather than depressed, right?
So there's definitely been studies that show that among Latinos in particular, that symptoms of depression actually manifest themselves looking more like anxiety, like a clinician might actually diagnose as anxiety, just because it's more culturally appropriate to behave in those manners rather than exhibit traditional symptoms of depression like crying and, you know, being in your bed and not wanting to get up, that fatigue. So culturally, those types of things aren't necessarily as accepted. However, there are symptoms of anxiety that end up being behaved more, or, you know, it's more symptomatic of anxiety, but it's sort of related. Exactly. So, and we have to think culture is definitely the way in which we navigate the world and in which we filter our behavior and, you know, and everything else, and how we function and behave. And so we're definitely going to have that be part of the way in which we cope with, you know, difficulties. And if we are suffering from a mental health issue, that's definitely going to be filtered by the way in which we're told how to act or what's acceptable, or, you know, not wanting to disappoint others and people in our family. That's definitely going to play a role in how we might be symptomizing a particular mental health concern.
Yeah. And I think a lot of these things actually start within the home from a very young age. Especially around, so my parents are from the islands, from Jamaica, and it's a part of the immigrant experience as well. You're going through a lot of stuff maybe in the house, and, you know, things are kind of, I'm not gonna say rough per se, but people are very abrasive in how they use their tones to each other throughout the house, and they're just talking, you know? And a lot of times to the child, it may not be coming off as, this is somebody who I can talk to, that I could tell my mother exactly how I'm feeling, you know? And all of that would happen throughout the years, and then by the time you hit 18, 19 years old, you've already developed this shell within yourself to kind of keep whatever I have going on in my head to myself. And then your parents may say, oh, you know, you can talk to me about everything, right? So I think we should try to culture a better understanding with our kids from an early age, you know, as far as mental health is concerned. Everything isn't just a phase, you know? Some things are valid signs that have to be looked at.
Well, that stress, you know, there's finding so many things that go back to those early adverse childhood experiences and the trauma of living in poverty, often coming from an immigrant, the stresses of being an immigrant, the stresses of just trying to survive in a world with systemic racism, and the effects that it has on the even childbirth experience. But interesting, you know, I hadn't really put it together with the way the conversation in the home might go and what that would do to the idea of the child expressing themselves. That's really powerful.
Yeah, and I also wanted to say, you touched on survival. Survival can do a lot to people in terms of their behavior. And that's why I like the fact that we're moving more from just saying mental health to behavioral health, because it's really a lot to do with the behavior. So we see when the hurricane is coming and there's scarce resources and people are in this survival state of mind and their behavior isn't normal anymore. So if you're being stressed out in an environment, you're living in poverty, day after day, you're thinking about survival, that's gonna affect the way you treat other people. That's gonna affect the way you look at the world. You may go through mood swings a lot more often in other communities. And because of that, you may develop what we call a mental health condition over time.
I think that's a really great point. I mean, if you think about, and it isn't just communities of color, because frankly, you know, Broward County is a very expensive place to live. And the fact is that the wages that are paid in our community But the gap between that and how much it costs to live here is the largest in the country. Even though there may be places like Boston or San Francisco where the rent is higher, their wages are higher as well. So families aren't as cost burdened in other places as they are in Broward. So you've got parents who are struggling to make ends meet and having to make choices between which bills to pay and how much food they can buy on any given paycheck. And then they're going to work and expected to be high-functioning, productive workers. And you've got their children going into classrooms where they're expected to be high-functioning, productive students. Both are completely stressed out, and there's a physiological response to that stress that makes it very difficult to pay attention, to detail, and to focus, and to be productive. And the systems that these folks are interfacing with are not necessarily cognizant of the impact of that stress and are very demanding on what their goal is for that person in that moment, right? And, particularly for children, since this is the focus on our children, it is extremely challenging. And, teachers are under-resourced and they're overburdened and they've got large classroom sizes and they have to teach to the entire classroom and they've got a set of standards that they have to meet through core curriculum. And the fact is that a majority of our students in Broward are coming so stressed out about other things that have nothing to do with their academics that they can't access the information that the teachers are there to impart. And so a whole school, whole community strategy is really what's necessary in order to engage people in a healing process so that they can be wholly functioning and healthy contributing members of our communities in the school, in the workplace, and just in general, really.
So I know that the school board is taking on social emotional learning, and they're looking at changing the way they function as a group, and we probably should do a show on that. Yeah. But I do want to let the viewers know about some of the things that are happening through the community supports as well, because I don't want to leave them just with the problems, but we are all working together to try and put some services in place if people will overcome that fear and actually reach out to them.
Yeah, I think Tiffany will be great to speak to that because she comes from the Behavioral Health Coalition, which is the managing entity for behavioral health services in our community. But before she goes to that, I just want to say to folks that, there are lots of services available. And there are lots of different approaches to beginning and completing a healing journey. And sometimes it takes a lifetime, and all of us have issues and concerns and challenges, and there are growth opportunities for all of us. But what I think is most critical for communities of color is the engagement piece. So there are tons of evidence-based practices available for clinicians to use when they're working with kids and families. And unfortunately, the rapport building phase of an evidence-based process tends to be quite short and doesn't take into consideration the cultural nuances that are present in each of the families of color that, we're talking about. And so, I've been a licensed clinician for about 25 years, and I'm trained in at least 10 evidence-based practices. And what I've learned over this career is that it doesn't really matter how much you know. What matters to families is how much you care. And you can't demonstrate that you care about them unless you're willing to put everything aside and engage one-on-one with a conversation that starts with, tell me who you are, tell me what's amazing about you. You've made it this far. You've overcome so much. How did you do that? And really connect with people on their humanity level. Get to know them and demonstrate authentic caring. And then you're at a position to be able to take whatever evidence-based practice you're trained in and employ that for skill building and strategy development with the family along the way. Not enough attention is paid to that rapport building phase, and we've really got to get a handle as systems around that for communities of color.
That's really powerful.
Yep.
Tiffany,
And I want to add to that. A lot of times you have young people and they come to you with their history. They may be involved in DJJ and Department of Juvenile Justice, and they may have what we would consider a negative rap sheet. And I would say, don't look at that. Don't focus on that, because there are a lot of other, things going on behind the scenes that you won't be able to capture or understand or learn about if you just look at that rap sheet. So that's a very important piece of connecting with people, is not judging them, and listening to their story and understanding what they need. And so one thing, some of the things that we do through One Community Partnership too, is we offer the basic services. So in Broward County, rent is high, it's expensive, for anybody. Even you have a decent paying job, it's expensive to live. We do offer a permanent supportive housing program, and that program helps young people ages 18 to 21 with living. And it's difficult if you're living off of Social Security alone to be able to afford an apartment in a decent area that you feel safe at. So that's one of our programs. We also offer a permanent supportive employment program. People need jobs, people want to work, and a misconception about young people with mental health is that they don't want to work, or people in general with mental health can't or won't work, or they won't keep a job. But the supported employment program, it helps people find a job, keep a job, and we have, seen a lot of people who are happy to work and are happy to live on their own. We also have a program through the Transition to Independence Process model. We call it the TIP model. And I always tell the young people, just think of TI. They know who that is, and you remember the name of it. But it's a life coaching program, so it's an evidence-based model where it's helping young people talk about their goals. So we're not coming and saying, well, we want you to do this. It's really, we want to understand what you want to do with your own life. And they'll tell you things that they won't talk to you about counseling, because that's not something they were taught in the home. But through engaging them on, housing, employment, on going to school, or whatever their goal is, they want to be a rapper, they start to learn about mental health throughout that process. So it's not just traditional, let's sit down behind this couch and talk to you about your problems. It's really about them saying, well, I don't want to talk about that all the time. I really want to live my life. And so that's what we're offering, those supports in the community.
And Easton, I think you've lived through the whole thing and are helping others with that process. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I've been through some depression myself. I've suffered from some anxiety growing up as a child. And a lot of times I found that I never really had much of an outlet to really express myself or have somebody to talk to about that. Growing up, going to therapy just wasn't something that was very much talked about. It wasn't something I was a fan of or that I was looking into. I started writing music, which helped me a lot. Helped me really a lot because, you put your talent out there and other people see something that you have and appreciate you for that. So that adds a lot of value and power to yourself. A part of what we do at Youth Move is kind of create those outlets for youth as peers to go through things like that, whether it's creating art or creating music, or sometimes we just sit and just talk, like Tiffany says, just tell us how your life is going. And that's basically what we do. These are some youth that have experiences with depression, anxiety themselves. Some of them has been through some of mental health services. Some of them come from DJJ. Some of them even come from foster care backgrounds. And we just want them to know that you're in a room where you have like-minded individuals just like you. And my first time going to Youth Move, what I liked about it is that nobody's perfect, and that's one of the biggest things that made me feel comfortable. Somebody may have a whole bunch of piercings, somebody may have tattoos, somebody may look a certain way, but everybody's there on the same level playing field, and everybody's just talking, and a lot of times I think that's what we need. And a part of our human psychology, that's what we crave for, being in an environment where we don't feel singled out. And a lot of people really like the program and they stick around for it.
That's great. Laura, I can't believe it, but we only have about a minute and a half to 2 minutes left. But that idea has changed the way we're looking at outcomes at the Children's Services Council. I know that's not why I asked you to sit here, but I think that has changed a bit how we're looking at that. Could you speak to that a bit?
Absolutely. I think we're definitely looking towards getting more direct feedback from our participants and clients in the community via satisfaction surveys, engaging with providers, to have qualitative focus groups, engaging with the community and community participatory action research so that we can get direct feedback from people receiving these services so that they can really produce the meaning around some of the quantitative numbers that we collect at CSC so that we can have a more richer and robust story around what's going on out there. Are our services working? Where can we pivot? Where can we do things better and increase our impact? So I think it's really important that we solicit these stories and continue to make changes so that people coming after you can benefit from what you've experienced and other people have experienced and what was helpful for them. So I think and that can help us build capacity even with our service providers. So our clinicians, like how you were saying in terms of improving the way in which they are able to build rapport with the Latino community, with communities of color. For a long time we talked about cultural competence, but really we need to be culturally humble and really be curious about a person's life experience and understand that they know more about their experience than we do. And so we need to adapt the way in which we know how to do therapy and provide services to best meet their needs from that perspective. We need to be the ones learning from that perspective.
And changing our goals so that it meets, if they're achieving what they want to achieve with their life, then that is really the goal.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I can't believe how fast the time has gone by.
Yeah.
See, I told you, a half an hour just flies like nothing. So I'm afraid we're going to have to turn to a close, but I am so grateful to have had this conversation. I know I learned a lot, and I hope you all have as well, seen that when dealing with and accessing behavioral health services, there are challenges that are specific to communities of color that must be addressed so that we can ensure that racial and cultural equity actually exists, and to assure communities of color that it's okay and that their life experience is valued. Ultimately, we all benefit from a system that is fully available to all. I want to thank Kimm Campbell, Tiffany Lawrence, Easton K. Harrison, and Laura Ganci for their insights on this very important conversation. I've been your host, Cindy Arenberg Seltzer. For this or any other episode of Future First, Focus on Broward's Children, go to our website, www.cscbroward.org, where you can access our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, and remember to join us next time on Future First, Focus on Broward's Children.